Shadows twist where whispers grow. The edge of light begins to flow. A world unseen through fractured glass, where futures meet the echoes past. Step closer now, the veil is thin. A riddle starts where dreams begin. The experimental medium calls your name. Nothing here will be the same.
Welcome to the Experimental Medium Podcast. Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating historical text. It's called A Brief Course in Mediumship.
And it's got quite a story behind it. Published way back in 1916 by McCoy Publishing and Masonic Supply Co. It was presented as instructions for newcomers to the Metropolitan College of the Societas Rosicruciana in America.
Yeah, and the author's just identified as KFRCX degrees. Very intriguing.
Definitely.
What really grabbed me about this source is its purpose.
Yeah.
It claims to offer a simple, concise, and logical classification and explanation of psychic stuff, of mediumship.
And the aim is specific, isn't it?
Exactly. It's explicitly stated to help you, the reader, develop his or her own inherent psychic powers. Though they're quick to add it's not the whole picture, and they definitely warn against trying to make a living from it.
Right. That's a key point they make. So our mission today really is to unpack this view from over a century ago, this Rosicrucian perspective. We'll look at how they classify things, the techniques they suggest, and maybe touch on some of the figures and ideas they reference.
It's a unique window, for sure.
It really is.
Now, right out of the gate, they make a fundamental distinction about mediumship itself, don't they?
They do. They split it into two main categories from their point of view. There's conscious or voluntary mediumship, they call that active.
Okay.
And then there's unconscious or involuntary mediumship, which they term passive.
And this course, this text, is aimed at developing which one?
Their goal is clearly stated as guiding people towards conscious mediumship. That's seen as the outcome of, deliberate development, training. It gives you more control, a broader perspective.
Whereas the passive type is more like innate sensitivity.
Pretty much. More like an uncontrolled hypersensitivity, often giving a limited view of things.
Okay, that sets the scene nicely. Let's start with their first classification. They call it a borderland to mediumship.
Psychometry, yeah, they place it right there, sort of bridging mediumship and what we'd maybe call modern psychology now.
And the name itself, soul measurement, comes from Dr. Buchanan back in 1842.
That's right, coined by Dr. J.R. Buchanan. Though, interestingly, the source itself kind of flags the name, calls it a possible misnomer.
Huh. So in their view, what is pure psychometry initially?
They see it as relying on a higher development of our ultimate sense perception. It's not automatically spiritual science, but they do say it can link up with clairvoyance and clairaudience, clear seeing and hearing.
And they bring in a quote from a prominent psychometrist, Mrs. Emmy F. Denton. She drew a very clear line.
She did. She said, basically, you can be both a medium and a psychometrist, but mediumship is not psychometry.
So what was her distinction? How did she separate them?
Well, for her, and the text backs this up, a medium relies on outside intelligences. They need to be passive to get the info. But a psychometrist, they depend entirely on their own internal faculties, powers of recognition, of comprehension, of discrimination. It means they need to be active, well-informed, critical thinkers about what they're perceiving.
Right, so it's about where the information comes from and how you process it, active versus passive.
Exactly. Big difference in control and source.
The text mentions some very practical, almost mundane uses for psychometry, too.
Yeah, things like holding an object to find water, or minerals, oil, hidden treasure even, identifying components in something, diagnosing illness, reading character, predicting if a business venture will work.
But they don't see those uses as proof of survival after death.
No. They note those applications hardly come within the scope of demonstrating a spirit entity or, the continuity of life. That's reserved for what they see as higher forms of mediumship.
So what is that higher form of psychometry in their system?
That's when you bring in spiritual intuition. You're actively using clairvoyance, clairaudience, and you understand the principles behind auras and vibrations. That level, the source says, does fall into spiritual investigation. It's reaching beyond just the physical imprint or subconscious feeling.
And if someone listening wanted to try and develop this, what's the method they suggest?
It sounds simple, but it needs discipline. You take an object you don't know the history of. They suggest jewelry, letters, flowers work well.
Okay.
Then you clear your mind, really focus on the object, and just say the very first impression that comes to you. Don't censor it. Doesn't matter how trivial or weird it seems.
Just blurt it out.
Pretty much. And also notice any physical feelings, heat, cold, nervousness, vitality, or mental states like worry or joy that pop up while you're holding it.
And then what?
The crucial step comes after. You then apply rigid examination, analysis, and critical judgment to those impressions. They suggest doing this for about 15 minutes every day.
It's interesting how they connect this to everyday experiences, like getting a bad vibe from a gift, or feeling something when shaking hands, or even getting caught up in an old friend's mood.
Yeah, they suggest those are hints of this ability working unconsciously. And to really show its potential, they recount this really remarkable test from 1909 with a Mrs. Margaret Gall Ratinger.
Ah, yes, the objects test. What were they again?
Two very distinct things. First, a trilobite fossil, super ancient, from Illinois. Her reading described, immense age, a world of vapor and water. She sensed life forms, but it just felt like a stone to her.
And the second object?
That was a piece of a meteorite. And not just any meteorite, one that had actually killed a laborer.
Wow. And her reading?
Completely different. She got impressions of incredible speed, intense heat, flames. Then she saw these strange beings, large heads, small bodies, not like us. And crucially, she felt a strong connection to a dead man, someone like us.
The contrast is amazing. And the details seem so specific. What did the source take away from that test?
They really leaned into the idea of the indestructibility of the psychometric aura, that objects hold on to this energy signature. And they argued that this kind of psychism could be a huge help to science.
Like an untapped resource.
Exactly. They used it to illustrate the battle for acknowledgement psychism faced from scientists, comparing it to, how long it took for things like the Copernican theory or hypnotism to be accepted.
That historical perspective is helpful. So psychometry is the borderland. Where do they go next? Into more direct spiritual perception?
They move straight into clairvoyance and clairaudience, clear seeing and clear hearing. And they suggest thinking about them together because they often show up together.
And again, the Rosicrucian angle is important here.
Very much so. They're careful to distinguish their teachings from, common practices, especially using these abilities just to make money for materialistic purposes. That, they say flat out, is totally foreign to the ideals and purposes of the Brotherhood.
They see a higher purpose.
Absolutely. They argue pretty strongly that cultivating these abilities with the right guidance is absolutely necessary for anyone they consider to be on the path towards true illumination. It's fundamental to their system of spiritual growth.
And these abilities aren't just for seeing spirits. They apply to the physical world, too.
That's right. They operate on both physical and spiritual planes. Can apply to everyday stuff, seeing things far away or close by, perceiving people's characters or states. They do make a distinction, though, from apparitions of the living, which they define more narrowly as multiple people seeing a vision of a living person without other psychic stuff happening.
The text even talks about physical manifestations, sometimes linked to things like hypnosis.
Yeah, they mention examples like descriptions in Dumas' novels or Dr. Quackenbos's experiments where hypnotized subjects could apparently see distant events or read sealed letters. Stage mind reading, they suggest, sometimes works by hypnotizing the performer.
What's the point they're making there?
That these abilities can sometimes pop up without what they consider essentially spiritual attributes. It's not always about high spiritual development. They even add this little aside, almost a warning, that extreme asceticism could potentially lead to black magic influences.
Whoa, okay, a bit dark.
Yeah.
And while you can use these abilities for things like finding minerals, there's a catch for higher level stuff.
Exactly. Using clairvoyance to perceive things like, say, chemical reactions or the deep structure of matter, that requires high spiritual attainments. Their reasoning is that the true home of matter isn't the physical world we see, but the invisible spiritual plane. To see subtle matter, you need to be able to perceive on those subtle planes.
Makes sense. So let's talk about spiritual clairvoyance then. How do they describe the initial stages?
They start with what they call lower phases. like being able to describe spirits who've recently passed, people functioning on the etheric or astral planes, often just for identification. But, and this is important that they state very clearly, this kind of perception furnishes no proof of immortality. It might suggest consciousness continues after death, but it doesn't prove eternal life in their view. They're also pretty skeptical about getting reliable IDs for spirits who died more than, say, a century ago.
And they have some criticism for professional mediums.
Oh, yeah. They critique the professional procedure of untrained mediums, claiming famous figures like Napoleon or Plato as their guides. They call that complete fallacy or at least uselessness for the true occultist.
Strong words. So how do they contrast that untrained state with a trained clairvoyant?
This is central to their idea of active development. They use analogies. Max Heindel's idea of different reporters describing a city, each gets only a partial, maybe skewed view, or the cosmoconception image of looking between the shutters of a blind. The untrained person's view is narrow, easily confused. The trained seer, though, sees widely. They can perceive the etheric, the astral, even the lower levels of the thought plane, and crucially, they learn to discriminate between the illusions of the world of desire, which they describe as vivid but temporary thought forms, and the real, true archetypes and conditions in the world of thought.
It sounds like going from a blurry snapshot to a high-definition panorama. What's involved in getting there, according to the source?
It's about learning what to see, then how to see it. Overcoming the limits of language, often using analogy. A trained clairvoyant develops conscious control, seeing what he will, as he will, where and when he will. Accurate description means separating, discriminating, weighing the different elements perceived.
And understanding the different worlds.
Yes, they stress that training must include the real conditions pertaining to each world because untrained people often see things from multiple levels simultaneously, which causes massive confusion.
They also mention auras and colors being important.
Extremely important. Auras and colors play a most important part. Color is often the very first thing perceived clairvoyantly, and they say a similar thing applies to clairaudience with sound and tone.
The text throws in some curious examples too, like that boy with X-ray eyes.
Yeah, the brain-free boy who could supposedly see inside people and help his doctor father. Fascinating anecdote. They also tackle the question, do clairvoyants see with their physical eyes?
And the answer is?
Kind of, yes and no. A trained seer can choose how they perceive, but the untrained person often feels the sensation through their physical eyes. It's the path of least resistance, you know? But it's not actual optical sight.
And hearing.
Similarly, they state flatly, no medium hears a spirit. Physical sound doesn't work on those planes. Music, for instance, is felt and seen through sensation of vibration. The sensation of hearing is real for the medium, but it's not auditory in our sense.
So how do these impressions come through for the untrained person?
Through undeveloped spiritual centers in the cerebrospinal system, that's what gives the impression of using normal senses. It's often called the sixth sense, and they link it to the pineal gland, claiming occultism holds the key to its mystery, referencing Rosicrucian symbology. Another example they give of this physico-spiritual clairvoyance is Molly Fancher of Brooklyn, who could apparently match colors blindfolded with her hands behind her back. Quite something.
So for development, they offer specific exercises again. What do they suggest for clairvoyance?
Crystallomancy is one method, gazing into a crystal ball or just a simple glass of water. Or even easier, using a card with a black dot or circle.
And the technique.
You hold your mind as blank as possible, concentrate your gaze. Early signs might be seeing a golden or fiery corona around the object, or maybe the dot seems to double up, which they say is just an optical illusion. The goal is to progress to a feeling of looking directly into black outer space.
Okay, that's the starting point. Where does it lead?
Next, you might start seeing cloud-like formations. They interpret these as spiral nebulae in the etheric region, like cosmic prototypes. Then come definite colors, then geometric shapes the sphere of archetypal forms. Eventually, parts of a human figure might appear, leading to seeing the whole figure in its spiritual state.
Are there physical sensations that go along with this? Signs you're making progress?
Yes, they mention seeing bright lights, maybe coming off another person, or just flashing in daylight. They see these as perceptions of the centers, ganglia, of the akashic light vibrations, basically, your subtle energy centers becoming active. And they explicitly call this a sign of encouragement.
So how do you make the leap from these passive impressions to the active conscious clairvoyance they value?
That's the big step. It requires real work. cultivating spiritual and mental powers, developing strong self-control and willpower, and actively working to increase the vibrational rate of your body's cells.
Mm.
The aim is to make bodily functions respond to your conscious will.
And once that's achieved?
Then clairvoyance and clairaudience become tools you can use consciously when and how you choose, rather than just things that happen to you.
So their definition of clairvoyance is fundamentally natural.
Exactly. They define it as the raising of one's powers of sense perception from a lower to a higher state of vibration. Not supernatural, just cultivation and expansion of faculties we already have. They even argue that science, with its understanding of unseen vibrations, actually supports this basic idea.
But development isn't enough. You need to understand what you're seeing.
Absolutely critical. They stress the need for thorough study of true occultism to interpret these experiences correctly, to put each impression in its proper place, and they end this section with a serious warning about your motive. Used for good, unselfishly, it brings progress and happiness. Used wrongly for selfish reasons, it leads to detriment and degeneration. Why you seek it matters immensely.
Okay, let's shift to the third area, trance, both conscious and unconscious. They start by admitting it's still pretty mysterious even to them.
Yeah, they're quite upfront that defining what trance is remains an enigma for occultists, psychologists, scientists, everyone, really. They see trance and consciousness as just different manifestations of one and the same group of mental functions, and they firmly state trance is always purely subjective. They dismiss the idea you can induce it independently, unaided, saying it always relies on some external or internal condition.
They mention the ancients held trance in high regard.
They did. Our masters in occult lore, they call them. And the source suggests the ancients actually valued trance more than clairvoyance for getting evidence. Clairvoyance was almost considered basic, a prerequisite for priests. But trance, especially when linked to prophecy, that was highly prized.
And what methods did the ancients use to help induce it, according to this text?
They list quite a few exterior processes, things like drugs, herbs, specific types of dancing for rhythmic vibration, using vapors like the Pythia at Delphi, also fasting, and interestingly, sexual excesses.
Really, how do they explain that?
They note it was used in India and the East to reach exalted states through physical exhaustion, clarifying it wasn't necessarily about modern ideas of degeneracy. And finally, singing is mentioned as a powerful accessory, appealing directly to the spiritual nature.
So how does the source break down the two main states of trance?
First is conscious trance. Here, the medium lets an outside intelligence use their physical body, but, and this is key, the medium keeps their own individual consciousness throughout. They see this as the highest form of trance development, but admit it's often viewed with suspicion, looks like cooperation.
Okay, and the other type?
Unconscious trance. This is described as a complete coma. The medium's physical body is totally under the control of the control intelligence. They liken it to a hypnotist and subject relationship.
And which one do they think is more valuable?
From their perspective, it's the unconscious trance that has supreme value. Why? Because the personality of the medium is eliminated. This, they believe, allows for direct communication without the medium's own thoughts or personality potentially getting in the way and confusing the message.
They share a pretty amazing story about this, involving a woman in Jersey City.
Yes, it's a striking anecdote. This woman, in deep unconscious trance, started speaking this obscure and extinct root dialect of the ancient Perso-Iranian tongue. A scholar later translated it. Apparently, the information that came through shed much light on hitherto obscure and unintelligible subjects, even helping with archaeological research.
Wow.
And the source notes the woman felt better afterwards, like she'd fulfilled a mission, even though she was just a passive instrument.
That's incredible if true.
Yeah.
What about the actual experience of developing trance? What are the symptoms?
For people suited to it, the first sensation is often like going under anesthetic, maybe even feeling like suffocation or strangulation. Can be scary, but they say there's no pain. They have a dramatic view. Entering trance as there is death, temporarily. The only difference is the silver cord, that energy link doesn't break.
That's intense.
It is. They also mention slight hysteria, like rapid deep breathing, can sometimes happen and actually acts as a safeguard against fraud. The peak moment of entering deep trance is described as feeling cold rain or moisture descend, like a shutter pulled down before their eyes and just blackness and coma.
And waking up from it.
You apparently just pick up your thoughts where you left off, totally unaware of the time that passed. Fatigue is common, though they warn that if you make trance a profession, it leads to physical problems, weird behavior, vanity, needing stimulants again, discouraging making it a livelihood. Once trance is set, communication starts with attempts to speak, then the actual messages from the control flow through. They suggest about an hour is a safe duration, but claim some authentic cases lasted days. They also float the idea that many historical cases of multiple personality or suspended animation might have just been simple cases of trance control.
The source diagrams the relationship. Operator, subject, medium, listener. And they have a specific idea about how spirits interact with the medium's body.
Yes, they're clear. Spirits do not really enter the subject's physical body like putting on a suit. Instead, they pass through it in the interpenetrative term of the fourth dimension. The control happens entirely outside the physical body.
The fourth dimension again. And it's not just any spirit for any medium. There's a kind of matching process.
Right. Similar to their other concepts, spirits are drawn to a medium's akashic light, their energy signature. One or more spirits who can establish rapport become the main permanent control or a band of guides. Other spirits usually have to communicate through these established controls. There's also a very brief, quite dense mention that the Shem HaMephorash from Kabbalah becomes obvious in the lines of direction produced during this, hinting at some underlying structure they saw.
Circling back to conscious trance, same initial feelings, but you stay aware.
Exactly. Same entry symptoms, but your consciousness doesn't leave. They see this as good for the medium's own learning, but less convincing as evidence for others because of that potential for conscious input. Fundamentally, they see trance as a transference of the medium's motor and sensory states to those of the operator. It's the phenomenon of control, a natural transmutation process.
Rapport is key here too, isn't it? Some people get results, others don't.
Definitely. Their explanation is that the controls can't just randomly pull spirits out of thin air or space. If the sitter doesn't bring specific influences or spirits with them, the controls might not be able to connect. And they add, maybe pointedly, sometimes it's just better that we do not get into communication.
The text also tackles the prevalence of Indian controls in America back then. What was their take?
Their 1916 explanation was basically that America was the Native Americans' homeland, they were displaced, and being children of nature close to the earth, their spirits naturally inhere in the plains associated with their ancestral lands. The source definitely holds a somewhat idealized view of the primitive Indian versus contemporary society.
And the medium's own consciousness, the ego, during deep trance, where does it go?
The source speculates it withdraws slightly with its subtle bodies, etheric, astral, mind stuff, holding itself in abeyance in a kind of coma state itself while the control is active.
But for someone seriously pursuing trance for spiritual growth, there's a specific advantage mentioned.
Yes, a great advantage. They believe trance development facilitates going out of the body consciously, not for showing off, but for deep spiritual work, communicating face-to-face with the guardians of our evolution, witnessing cosmic processes. They call this the highest accomplishment.
But only for the unselfish.
Yes, attainable only for those with pure motives, beyond just curiosity or desire. And achieving that level of knowledge requires unwavering concentration.
They seem pretty dismissive of just explaining it all away as the subconscious mind.
Very dismissive. They call that idea absurd and illogical, especially when you see a total change of personality, voice, manner, and information comes through that the medium couldn't possibly have known normally. The evidence for them points strongly to an external intelligence.
But they do acknowledge a potential physical downside to trance development.
They're quite frank about it. Achieving trance often comes at the expense of ideal physical conditions. It can strain the heart, the nervous system. They specifically mention angina pectoris as being common. Also, sometimes a peculiar loss of control in speech. Ooh. So summing up their view on trance, clairvoyance might be a birthright, but seeking trance is like knocking boldly at the door of the unknown, trying to lift the veil of Isis. At our current evolutionary stage, it involves some sacrifice of normal physical well-being. Still, they feel for the unselfish seeker it's an ideal well worth the seeking. The rewards are great, its uses almost incalculable, and it holds keys to psychology if science would only look.
It's a fascinating, if slightly daunting, perspective. Let's move to the fourth state. Inspiration. They say it's a common word, but its real weight is often missed.
Yeah, they contrast it with people just calling any sensible comment inspired when it's just, common good sense. To get at real inspiration, they point to dictionary definitions involving an elevating influence, even supernatural or divine influence, qualifying people to receive and share divine truth, sometimes down to the exact words.
So it's much more than just being eloquent.
Vastly more, they argue. It's not just about saying good things or moving an audience with rhetoric.
They use a powerful biblical example.
Pentecost. The tongues of flame, speaking in other languages, they see that as a visible expression of the spiritual afflatus, that divine inbreathing.
And a key point they make is that it doesn't require the person to be highly educated or intellectual.
Absolutely. Real inspiration does not depend upon the intellectual accomplishment of the instrument. They point to the fishermen of Galilee, to Lincoln. They even suggest it's often more obvious when the person is uncouth and unpolished, because the inspiration shines through with untarnished brilliancy, convincing people without needing logical arguments. They contrast this with polished speech that sometimes lacks soul.
So how do they describe the actual process? How does inspiration happen?
They see it as absolutely the work of higher spheres. It's not the speaker generating it consciously. The human's role is to be open, utmost openness of mind and thought, total freedom of expression, and a real, sincere desire to act as the messenger. They mention groups like the Quakers or Holy Ghosters as relying on this openness. Mechanically, they describe it as the activity of spiritual force or forces. Could be one entity, could be a unified group acting on the brain from unseen realms. Similar to trance, it involves a gradual inhibition of the physical sensoria, not to coma, but to a balanced state. This allows the operating forces to feed in thoughts, ideas, and impulses. They even suggest the exact thought process can be guided externally once that initial connection is made.
Are there physical feelings associated with being inspired?
Yes, they list symptoms like increase of temperature, a sense of oppression, maybe increased heart action. Rarely fatal, but they mention cases of speakers collapsing after particularly brilliant, inspired moments.
And for a speaker, what's the experience like as it unfolds?
They describe a psychic sort of warming to it. Might start with a brief sensation like instantaneous strangulation or maybe stumbling over words slightly, but then it flows. The person feels conscious, but aware of a power supporting him, supplying the ideas with intensity, clarity, conviction. They feel the audience is in his power because they are speaking in the power of the spirit.
But this raises a critical question the source itself asks. Where does inspiration come from? Is it always positive?
Crucial point. They state clearly it's determined by character and not necessarily good. The unseen world has all sorts, they say, and diabolical concepts can definitely be inspired. Higher attempts might seem strange, while lower earthbound spirits might give accurate facts but also inspire harmful thoughts. They use erotic poems with beautiful language but damaging ideas as an example.
So you attract what you are, essentially.
Generally, yes. A psychic ordinarily attracts inspiratory forces according to his character and personality. Although they do allow for apparent inconsistencies, where sometimes great insights come through unexpected or seemingly unworthy people, maybe out of cosmic necessity.
But does background and education ever help?
Yes, they modify that earlier point. Once you recognize inspiration and consciously offer yourself as an instrument, then education, eloquence, culture become of inestimable advantage. It provides less resistance, helps the forces express themselves more effectively. This blend creates the golden-tongued orators, and they point to Robert G. Ingersoll as an example. And while speaking is common, writing is also a channel, right?
Yes, they call writing a greatest channel for reaching the world. I mentioned Henry Van Dyke, a clergyman turned ambassador who claimed a book of his was inspired. He faced ridicule from press and science, but the source suggests history would remember Van Dyke, not his critics. Now, the source moves to what it considers the pinnacle, the greatest of all achievements.
Right. They give this section the rather grand title, Entering the Silence. This, they say, requires a well-developed psychic. It's a state where the I, or ego, along with its subtle bodies, etheric, astral, mind, is free to roam up to certain planes while still connected by the silver cord.
And how you get there is different from just falling into a trance.
Fundamentally different, yes. Trance often involves waiting for a coma. Entering the silence is achieved consciously. You will the inhibition of the physical senses and the etheric body's activity. You separate the higher vehicles from the lower ones deliberately, just as he wills, discarding his clothing in the act of retiring. The key is, consciousness is retained every moment. You consciously will yourself out of the physical and etheric shells.
And the results of achieving this state are quite profound.
Very. They list things like being able to astrally project to friends, becoming an apparition of the living, seen consciously in multiple places, experiencing the fourth dimension of space directly, realizing there are innumerable dimensions.
And this isn't achieved through external aids like crystals.
Definitely not. No exterior accessories. It's the result of intense inner work, meditation, concentration, abstinence, fasting. They do add, though, that friends on the other side often help in the first attempts until you get the hang of it and conquer the enemy at the threshold. A term they say Rosicrucians understand, referring to overcoming lower astral hurdles or parts of the self.
What's the initial experience like? Is it smooth?
Not always. First attempts might involve a momentary loss of consciousness, very brief, a sensation of blackness, so intense that one can feel it. Feeling unconscious for a split second. Language fails here, they admit. But after those first times, you become absolutely conscious during every moment of the transition. And that transition itself becomes fascinating.
Oh. How does perception change during that transition? Physical versus spiritual?
What we see as solid matter becomes vapor-like, interpenetrative. It looks the same, but offers no resistance to your focused will. Simultaneously, what normally seems like faint spirit, seen clairvoyantly, becomes real, tangible, and material. And interestingly, right after that moment of blackness, the initial perception is often of a grayish environment, a gray fog, but without moisture. They disagree with calling the astral the gray world, though. They think this initial gray is due to either imperfect separation of the subtle bodies, affecting vision like a newborn's, or disturbance during that profound shift where matter becomes spirit and spirit becomes matter.
So in this state, the astral and other planes feel completely real.
Just as real, tangible, and objective as the physical, they claim, but governed by different laws. Physical adornment means nothing. Only the natural outcome of cosmic process is real. The astral body is naturally nude, though clothing can be manifested by will. No sex conditions, as we know them. No physical procreation. Sex force is transmuted into a higher state where color, music, form, harmony become real, tangible, living things, providing pleasure beyond physical concepts.
And once mastered, leaving and returning is just a matter of will.
That's the sign of mastery. Someone who achieves this is a master, adept, chela. But the source strongly pushes back against ideas of godlike beings with miracle powers appearing only to a select few. They call that defiance of all cosmic law.
They seem very grounded in human potential.
Extremely. Nature intends each human being to be essentially human while incarnate. No half-gods, half-men. Developed beings who stay aloof are seen as unnatural monstrosities.
What the world needs, they say, is
Workers, not demigods. Healthy common-sense occultism doesn't aim higher than that. They acknowledge their own Rosicrucian initiates achieve the highest possible development while human, but these people are essentially workers among humanity and for humanity, teaching only what humans can attain. No hidden Mahatmas. They advocate working in the open, in cities, valuing cleanliness and sociability, citing these as old traditions. The secret of the Philosopher's Stone, they suggest, proves that perfection is approached through normal, not abnormal, living.
a very practical, almost workaday view of high spiritual attainment. Okay, final section. Physical mediumship. This covers the really tangible stuff: telekinesis, wrappings, visualization or materialization, levitation, handling fire, immunity to poison.
Right. They call them physical because they don't seem to rely on the medium's normal senses, but demonstrate some kind of dynamic force guided by intelligence.
And a key observation across all these phenomena:
the medium's vitality gets drained, more or less exhausted. This leads them to the big unanswered question for psychical science back then. Is the operating intelligence using the medium's energy, or is the medium just depleted due to their own hypersensitivity?
how does this Rosicrucian text explain it?
Through the etheric vehicle again. An untrained psychic, they say, involuntarily lends his etheric vehicle to spirits, sometimes for trivial effects, like an organ grinder directing a monkey.
But the trained psychic,
The trained psychic consciously functions within his etheric vehicle, under their own control, to manipulate the potentialities of the etheric plane directly. They use an analogy. We manipulate physical matter using energy transformation, heat, light, etc. Physical phenomena originate in the etheric world, resulting from activity in specific ethers: chemical, life, light, reflecting. The medium's etheric body is like a power station, transmuting etheric waves into physical effects. Untrained, spirits use the station. Trained, the psychic is the operator in the station, directing forces by will.
so the core process is setting up the right mode of motion in the etheric, driven by will.
That's it. The actuary is will. It directs the cosmic energy of the ethers. Proof, they say, is that results depend on the psychic's willpower, while vitality affects the duration and strength of the phenomena.
They mention physical contact being helpful sometimes.
Yes, touching the medium's hand or foot, or using a conductor like a ruler, can boost the transmuting power. But, big problem for proof, it raises suspicion of fraud. Phenomena without contact are vastly more conclusive, but harder to achieve and usually weaker.
The text revisits immunity to poison here, linking it to a specific mental state.
Right. They mention Indian snake rituals, St. Paul and the viper. They reject ecstasy explanations. For them, the whole matter is one of will, total absence of fear, and complete confidence. They link it directly to faith, quoting scripture about moving mountains. It's mind over matter, essentially.
In levitation, they cite the famous D.D. Home case.
They do. Witnessed by royalty, floating horizontally, passing through windows. They accept it as history, done by an advanced medium for a laudable purpose. Their explanation. Will overcomes physical cohesion, allowing etheric permeation. Ether's influx, making the body less subject to gravity, usually lifted inches or feet. This equilibrium allows projection into the astral while still visible physically.
A demonstration of the fourth dimension again.
Exactly, occupying two worlds at once. Gravity works differently in spiritual worlds, more about balance under will. The levitated body is directed along etheric currents. Similar principles apply to moving objects, they say.
What about simple wrappings or knocks? Not spirit knuckles.
Definitely not spirit knuckles, they call that absurd. It's
Cool.
about reducing atomic cohesion at a point, then directing etheric force to cause a concussion, creating sound waves. Can happen even on soft surfaces like cloth.
Moving to visualization, or what's often called materialization, they seem very skeptical.
Extremely skeptical. The common idea of spirits quickly grabbing matter to walk around, they deem that impossible because illogical. Given how long they think it takes for an ego to build vehicles after death, grabbing matter in minutes is absurd. They even mention fake materialization outfits being sold.
So what do they think is possible? What's really happening in genuine cases?
They call it visualization. A spirit on the astral plane directs etheric forces to gather enough astral matter to reflect light under the right conditions, becoming visible. That's what they believe is happening. They add a cynical remark about how to spot fakes grabbing the sturdy hand of father results in a howl of pain from a shrill feminine voice. Handling hot coals, though, they accept as undoubtedly genuine, citing Oriental priests, accomplished by functioning in the etheric body, making it dominant. They also mention a Rosicrucian hypothesis linking it to fire elementals, noting Japanese adepts claim cooperation with them.
Spirit writing, and especially spirit pictures, are treated as interesting possibilities.
Yes, the source shares a personal story. A detailed color picture, paste loyal, appearing on canvas under absolute test conditions, medium separate, no prep. The picture was a portrait of someone unknown to the writer who died before they were born. The explanation. Color properties transmitted from the etheric, crystallizing on transition, reflecting an image from the astral light onto the surface, becoming permanent. Spirit photography. Similar idea, spirit uses the negative, allows reflection through the lens.
And automatic writing gets a nod as potentially useful.
Valuable, yes. Contributed to astral knowledge. Can happen with or without trance, like Mrs. Piper. Often involves the psychic's etheric arm controlling the physical arm. They say it's a phase almost anyone can acquire.
How do they suggest developing it?
Sit daily, 30-60 minutes, arm relaxed, pencil on paper, don't try. Expect unintelligible scrawls first, then purpose and legibility emerge. Keep your mind lightly on something else to avoid mistaking muscle twitches for writing.
Given all the potential for trickery and physical stuff, do they warn against specific things?
Oh, definitely. Things needing props, like trumpet communications, ringing of bells, tambourines, are dismissed as beneath our sober consideration, just amusement for the gullible or tools for charlatans. The safe rule. Avoid phenomena needing slates, bells, cabinets, except paper pencil for automatic writing.
They seem to feel the focus on phenomena itself is becoming less important over time.
That's their perspective. As knowledge grows, phenomena matter less, historically used to exploit superstition or fear. They credit groups like the BSPR and ASPR for gathering information, but say witnessing phenomena isn't necessary for learning. Phenomena are like illustrations to a book, helpful sometimes, but the picture alone rarely conveys lasting deep thought, and the temptation to get stuck only on phenomena is strong, they warn, almost overpowering. Those who do seldom returns to the ranks of the thinkers who have succeeded in getting beyond. Phenomena have a place. Controlling the ability is valuable, but it's not the main goal.
The source also deliberately leaves some things out.
Yes, they specifically say they aren't covering psychic centers, the solar plexus, or how to unlock them. That's esoteric work for guided, advanced study.
And their very last piece of advice for students.
A strong warning. Earnestly advise all sincere students to shun so-called development circles. They see dangerous pitfalls for health and mental balance in those group settings. Develop alone, they advise, though flowers and incense can help create the right atmosphere for solitary work.
Wow. What an incredibly detailed journey through this 1916 Rosicrucian perspective. We've covered so much: their views on psychometry, clairvoyance, clairaudience, the complexities of trance, inspiration, the heights of entering the silence, and all those physical phenomena.
Correct.
Plus the methods, the warnings.
Yeah, and several key themes keep coming up, don't they? That distinction between passive sensitivity and active conscious development. The absolute necessity of unselfish spiritual growth versus just making a living or showing off. And framing it all, even levitation, as natural law, just operating on unseen levels like the etheric plane.
The cautions really stand out too. The physical toll of some paths, like trance. The constant warnings about fraud and misleading influences. And that core idea of needing to be master of yourself, making sure you're dealing with angels of light, as they put it.
Absolutely. And maybe a good final thought to leave you with comes right from the book's opening quote. It says something like, "Few there be who, seeing, see, and hearing, hear, and understand the unutterable things that encompass us." This text really is one specific historical map, a Rosicrucian map from 1916, suggesting ways we might start to bridge that gap, how we might begin to see, hear, and maybe understand those unutterable things, using the potential they believe lies within our own psychic powers if we approach it with wisdom and the right heart.
It really does make you think about the spectrum they lay out, from basic impressions to consciously navigating other dimensions, and the sheer effort they imply is needed: concentration, discipline, motive, facing down your own inner enemy. Definitely a lot to chew on from a text that's over 100 years old.
Whispers creeping through the haze, shadows dance in twisted ways, echoes hum from worlds unseen. This is where the strange convene. Step into the unknown mind, secrets hidden, twist and bind, truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream. A voice that stirs the silent night, unexpected tones. Reality's edge becomes your home. Questions rise like fragile smoke. The uncharted realm silently speaks.